We have been proceeding through the first book of the Bible, and now we are going to take a look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 6, and go on from there. We learned Cain had become angry at Abel and at God because of God's acceptance of Abel's offering. Cain's reaction was to become very angry, and this sinful reaction will result in even more sin. And that's the tragedy of sin. Sin never stops. We think we can stop it, but I'll tell you, the moment that we start getting angry, we are going to lose control of our feelings and of our actions, and the next thing that can be seen very, very frequently is a lot more sin. So we then read in verse 6 of chapter 4 of Genesis that God spoke to Cain. We don't hide from God. God sees our sin. We read, "And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth?" That is, why art thou angry? Why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shall thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Now, here we have an interesting sentence where God is taking the action. The fact that we are upset because of something God has done indicates we're already in trouble with God. Sin is lying at the door. What door? The door of our heart, the door of our being. We are about to fall into sin. One of the things we should be seeking out in our own lives is, as soon as we begin to feel angry or feel impatient or anything that is not pleasing ordinarily to God, we should know that we're on the threshold of sin. And sin is never going to be good. And as we're going to see in the life of Cain, it can lead to some very, very tragic and terrible results in our life. So we read here, "And unto thee," God is saying to Cain, "shall be his desire." That is the desire of sin. "And thou shalt rule over him." That is, sin is spoken of as a persecutor, as someone who is ready to make us fall in rebellion against God. And the place to stop it cold is right at the beginning. And how many of us do that? God is explaining to Cain that he should not be angry. God's response to his offering was understandable and fair. If he had done well, if he had not become angry, in other words, if his heart had been right with God, he would have been accepted. And what a wonderful thing that is, to be accepted of God. But if he had not done well, it was going to lead to sin. Sin is a hole that we dig which has no bottom. It just takes us down, 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 closer and closer to the wrath of God and to hell and all the ugly things that go with sin. We will see that this was the case as we go on in this account. In spite of God's admonition to Cain, Cain was harboring his great anger. Even after God spoke to him, he did not humble himself before God as he should have. You see, that's part of the problem. We become so angry that no matter what God says to us, we know we are right, We are not going to humble ourselves or admit our wrongdoing. And that's the place where Cain found his position, and that is what's going to lead to a terrible, terrible sin. And believe you me, neither you nor I are any more safe than Cain was. If we fall into sin and we don't humble ourselves and cry to God for mercy, we too can fall into a similar sin. And when we look at that sin, we're going to be amazed at how terrible it was. And we'll come to that in a moment. Because after God spoke to him, he had become angry at Abel and at God because Cain's will had been contradicted. And he couldn't stand it, that he could not have his way. So we see the result in verse 8 of Genesis chapter 4, where we read, "And Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him." Wow! He killed his brother because of anger. That seems like a drastic thing to do, and it is a drastic thing to do. But God is showing us how sin can multiply greatly quickly, and we will fall into that kind of a sin. That's not a little sin, that's a terrible sin. That's the sin of murder. It had nothing to do with Abel sinning against his brother. It was simply that he didn't like the way God treated himself, because he was not being faithful like his brother. And it was murder, outright murder. We don't have to be shocked, really, when we read the newspaper, when we read the news items every day. Murder is everywhere, for every kind of a reason. Murder has hold of mankind, and it began right here, where Abel is murdered by his brother Cain. This terrible action of murder was further proof that Cain was not right with God. Oh my, talk about proof. It was a glaring piece of proof, because murder means that we have done a terrible, terrible act against one of our fellow humans, and at the same time we have rebelled terribly against God. God did not create our friends and our family and our fellow humans to be killed by us. No way. It's bad enough if we would go away in a sulk because we didn't get our way. That would be terrible sin already. But when it results in murder, it's gone the whole course. Cain was not a true believer. That's a very true statement. He had a trust in himself, not in God at all. And because he had no trust in God, he took the law into his own hand. When God confronted Cain about his attitude, instead of repenting and begging God for mercy, he continued on in an even greater sin, the sin of murdering his brother. We find that that is commonplace in the world today. Murder is going on everywhere. This is simply the beginning of what is going to be a chief characteristic of the earth in time. And in our time, murder is escalating. It is getting more and more common. Sin begins in the heart. It begins in our thought life. We cannot look at someone's heart and know if they are right with God or not. But God cannot be fooled. He knows what's going on in every man's, every woman's, every child's heart. He looks right at our heart. He knows our thoughts. and also the intents of our heart. My, and how often have we become so sinful? Here, right at the beginning of mankind, we see the awful results of sin. Because Adam and Eve rebelled against God, sin came into the world, and it came in its worst way, murder. Murder was not a product of long development that just slowly grew. It's one of the first sins that God points out to us because of Cain's unrepentant heart. That is the result of sin. And if it happened to Cain, it can happen to any one of us. That is the nature of man. Now in our next study, we will see God's response to Cain's sin of murder. So we go on in our study of the first family of Adam and Eve that ever lived on this earth. Until then, may the Lord richly bless you.